Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're very happy that you could make it. Before we get started, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And so today we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I'd also like to quickly take a moment to introduce our seminar series, which has been going for quite some time. So the Native Voices in STEM seminar series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center, the University of Arizona, Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, and the Native Fuse Alliance, as well as the Office of Societal Impact. And this seminar series highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists, providing students with an opportunity to network and learn about the research and careers of Native leaders in various fields. Each session includes a Q&A segment at the end, where all attendees are encouraged to engage with the speaker, ask questions, and participate in the discussion. So today I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Johnson, who is an Indigenous scholar and practitioner whose work centers on food sovereignty and Indigenous agriculture. He's also an awesome part of our core faculty here at the Indigenous Resilience Center. His current talk, The Restoration of Indigenous Food Systems, What Will It Take?, addresses the deep-rooted connections between food, culture, and community resilience, while also exploring the systemic challenges that must be addressed to achieve true food sovereignty. Dr. Johnson brings a wealth of knowledge on Indigenous-led agricultural restoration, traditional ecological knowledge, and the pathways forward to restoring sustainable food systems in Native communities. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Michael Johnson.
Hello, how's everybody doing here? I'm glad to see everybody here. I was in Salt River yesterday talking to the community over there, looking at some of their agriculture issues, but just seeing what's going on the ground over there. And so, I kind of like, to introduce myself. I was called myself a 250th generation Hopi farmer. And I say that because, that's what the archaeological record says, but that's also what, we've been out there for a long time at Hopi. And so we're able to, survive in a very semi-arid region. I always like to say we do more with less than a lot of things that are going on in the world today. So, let me just go ahead and share my slideshow presentation here. Okay. So, I wanted to talk about the restoration of the indigenous food systems. And, one of my main goals is what I call the revitalization of the American Indian food system. And I can talk about that in general as I go through here, but that's kind of what I kind of want to embark on my career on. It's just because I see so much value in it. Things that I see so, as I started to say, let me go back a few things. As I started to say, I think this is very important. Our agricultural systems, we've been able to survive on these systems for hundreds and thousands of years. And the nutrition that comes with these systems is very valuable for us. And I say that because, like we have one reservation down here in Arizona that has about an 80% diabetic rate, which is really unheard of. In fact, they're the highest diabetic rate in the whole entire globe. And there's really no shame on that. It's just that some of the food systems that we've been given and stuff like that don't really fit our bodies for a number of reasons. And that's why I'm also a big supporter of food as medicine. So, this restoration of the indigenous food systems, what will it take? First of all, you kind of have to understand that, indigenous agriculture in general is value driven. Values meaning that it incorporates a lot of things that, we learn to as children and grandchildren and the things that we hope to pass on. But this is an example of just a small example of some of the values that I'm talking about. This is a rock that's up at Hopi called Prophecy Rock. It's well documented, it's well talked about, but this is the version that I was given to my grandfather as a little child. We went up there and you can see two different paths that go across this rock. There's two lines that jet off that square right there. To the left of you or to the right of you, and you'll see a bunch of figures holding hands up there as they go up that little staircase right now. I was told that little staircase represents a lot of things that we'd find in today's world, things like conveniences, all the things that, made life easier for us. But you can see at the end of that path, it ends abruptly. It drops off. Down below, you'll see a gentleman on the path who's our gentlewoman who's on the path, who's actually planting in their field. They're continuing to plant. Agriculture is a big part of our system at Hopi. There's no real separation between our values, our agricultural system, our spiritual beliefs, in our food system. They're all intertwined. You can't separate them. But the meaning of this is that if we're able to hold on to those values, some of those things that kept us stronger and kept us moving throughout this century and through the times before, we'll keep going. We'll keep surviving. We'll keep doing the things that keep us healthy, that makes us survive. Now, what's unique about this particular petroglyph is that line that connects the two just before the farmer. That's the time that we're living in. And I was told that's the time we're living in. It's a time of choice. And I feel like some of that choice has to do with the decisions we make on our daily lives. And so I choose to be that little pathway in between. I look at myself as a bridge to try to connect these worlds, to kind of integrate and tell people, maybe we should think about doing stuff that we learned from our grandfather, the values that I thought would be very important in our life, and to my mind are still very important today. So a lot of this is like intergenerational driven. A lot of our agricultural system, I call myself a 250th generation farmer. There you have my father on the far left, my great grandfather, my grandfather. And then because of modern technology, AI or not AI, I was able to Photoshop myself in there. And I think it's the value of that. That's at least 4 generations of us, each learning from the other, learning those values, learning those things that are important, learn how to survive on minimal amount of water. And I'll explain that when I get to the part of when I start looking at some of the techniques and some of the incredible science that's behind that. So that's what I'm talking about, this intellectual driven Hopi type of agriculture or agriculture in general. So, what are some of these values that I talk about? Some of these values in indigenous agriculture that I learned, that other people learned are things like respect, reciprocity, nurturing, self-worth, confidence. But the most important thing that I've learned basically is humbleness. I don't think I really get humble until I'm out there in my field in the springtime, just planting with my planting stick and my seeds and my water to put in the ground if I need to. Those are the things that I value the most. Those are the things that are important because not only is there nutritional aspects involved in these indigenous agricultural systems, but there's tremendous amount of identity. There's a tremendous amount of respect. There's the main reason why I feel like, you have high rates of biodiversity on the planet, you also have high rates of language. That's incorporated because there's this relationship that's been established. There's this relationship that keeps these things going. These things thrive not only in the past, but are into the present and will be into the future if we hold on to those things. But part of the problem is what I call, redefining the narrative. I think, too many times, we look at regenerative agriculture as just a process. I just happened to be giving a talk in Anaheim, California, where they talked about the process of regenerative agriculture. All the companies are there talking about, microbes of the soil and how they can bring and revitalize those things. But regenerative agriculture, in my mind, is still a process. Even though I do support this, it's still trying to repair the tremendous damage that was caused by conventional agriculture throughout the years here in the United States and now throughout the globe. And so this regenerative agriculture, it's a good thing. But if we're going to give credit to the indigenous people like we have been, like permaculture, and they say, well, the indigenous people has already done this before. But let's look at kind of reframing it a little bit if we're going to do that. So I came up with a now published definition of indigenous regenerative agriculture. But the most important thing is marked in red. It says place-based ways of knowing based on land use management schemes adapted for survival. Now, this is the key, which are supported by culture, belief systems, and community that's been incorporated for over millennia. And that is so important, as I said, because indigenous agriculture at its core is about that. It's about what's highlighted in red. It's the ability for us to adapt, for us to survive, and for us to continue on. So it's very important to understand that. So redefining the narrative is what I'm saying is that, if we're to have a place in this, and this goes back to the title of my presentation, how will it work? It's just trying to change things about a little bit so that people can understand where we're coming from, what our values are. Because in my mind, we can have no real effective communication unless we understand each other first. And that takes time, but we're trying to do that here at the Indigenous Resiliency Center. So one of the important things as I go into regenerative agriculture, or actually indigenous agriculture, is the women's role in farming. I think there's this mixed conception that I've seen, talking to my other farmers, that it's just the men's place to farm. And it is. And we manage the fields, but it's the women who actually own the fields. They own the seeds. They own the harvest. They're the seed selectors. They're the geneticists. They go out and they really select for those things to keep those varieties pure, and they give them to the men before we plant. It's very important that they have that. This is not a society, it's a matrilineal society, but it's not really based upon genders. It's based upon looking at trying to collaborate what people could share with each other to bring that along. And I think that's very important. So the women's role in farming, in my mind, is probably one of the most important things as far as our agricultural system, because they keep us straight up. They keep us where we're supposed to be. And also when I was talking about this integration, I'll start going into a little bit of the importance of the spiritual things that we talk about here. It's just our way of life. It has always been that way. I believe that I was told a story about my grandfather that we were up here, we greeted somebody, and they said that in order to survive in our arid environment, that we need to have a planting stick, a gourd, and some seeds, and we'll be able to survive. But the most important thing that person said is that we need to have faith in everything we do. We need to have faith in everything we do, because when times get tough out here, which they do, because we don't always have a crop, we need something other to rely upon, something else to keep us going. So it's just very important that we all understand that. Part of the integration is, part of our food system, when I'm trying to make that connection, is that, this is a simple agricultural calendar, but it also incorporates our ceremonial cycle that we have in there. The word muya means moon. So these all correspond to the moon from the time we plant to the time we harvest. But if you look at the little figure in December, a kakamuya, that's the time that we rest. We give the ground a chance to rest. We usually stay in our homes, and it's also a month that's kind of dark for us. And so we'll stay in there and we'll tell stories. We'll pass those stories down from generation to generation. And there is the beauty of the system. We're teaching the next generation what's important. It's so important for me for the children to only stand the process, but it's more important to have to understand the why they're doing this, why this is important to their lives. It's very important that we emphasize those points. So this relationship with nature, I like to define it in a way that, people could really understand it. At least I try to have them understand it. There's my house. It's got probably twice as big now. It's above my fields up at Hopi, and when I was building my house out of sandstone, under one of those awnings over there, there was also a bird building his house out of sandstone, or her house out of sandstone. In my mind, I had to slow down just enough to say, who's teaching who here? Where's the beauty of this? The beauty of this lies in that relationship, that understanding of what's around us, that place-basedness that I often talk about, the importance of place, a place to call home, someplace you can always go back to, I think is very important. It is integral in making sure that we do what works to continue on the system as it is today, and maybe improve on it, maybe not. So, what did I say? Agriculture is often place-based. Look at that landscape. I saw something similar when I was in Israel, and I got to look above Masad and look down at the Negev Gezer down there and got to see something very similar like that. But here's a place that we've been calling home for the last 3,000 years, if not longer. Look at the environment. Look at the dryness of the environment. When I was at Cornell, they said I needed 33 inches of rainfall a year in order to grow crops in a very limited amount of an environment like this, very semi-arid environment, which we only receive 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. They said corn takes 33 inches of rainfall a year, and I couldn't believe they were telling me that, but that's what they told me. And I said, well, something must be wrong with your corn, because I can do it, or 6 to 10, But all joking aside, I think it's important. The concept of place is very important. And for people to understand that and things to grow in those places and to bring those back, because they do grow in those places, is very important. It all has to do with a lot of biodiversity, and I'll talk about that as I go. So where is this place? Well, Hopi is, first of all, it's a very semi-arid environment. It's on the northeastern part of Arizona. It's up on what they call the Colorado Plateau. It's about 45 to 55 foot in elevation. And like I said, we only receive 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. Primarily consists of shrubs and grasses, desert shrubs and grasses, and all these sand and clay loams which we plant on. So, this cultural continuity is grounded over in time. And when I'm talking about the knowledge of place, this continuity that we've had, if you look at the pictures in 1915 and you look at the ones in 2015 of my fields, you can see that the traditional methods and the indigenous places that we're doing things have not changed over at least that 100 years right there. It's still the same. And I could almost guarantee you, if you took a picture in 1818, 1718, 1218, those systems will look pretty similar, because those are the kind of systems that you get when you live in a particular place over an amount of time. Those crops also have a chance to I wouldn't call it morphosize, but to adapt into a dry climate. And so they're very valuable. So you imagine that 3,000 years of cultivating in this particular fashion and learning through trial and error. All the scientific tests were done because we have over 3,000 years of observation, and that's a whole different subject here. This allows us to stay there. This allows us to be there. But remember that I said that it's also part of our cultural belief system. So when we don't have a crop, we have substitutes. We have psychological things that get us through, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the highlights that I'm always like to say is, is that Hopi is one of the few places I know where corn is raised to fit the environment and the environment not manipulated to fit the corn. Now, what does that mean? That means that we don't have to manipulate everything. We don't have to use all those inputs, like, unfortunately, like a lot of farmers that are doing today, that we don't have to use the pesticides, the herbicides. We don't even have to truck in the water. We're able to do more with less. It's just using our traditional techniques adapted over time that allows us to thrive in this location on a good year. And in a bad year, we have contingency plans. So what are the two key factors in Hopi agriculture? Well, for us, it's just the amount of snowfall we have. I was told that as a little child too. The more snow we get in the wintertime, the better off we'll be, because of the layout of our soils. It's kind of a stratified type of soil where you have a sandy layer, a clay layer, sandy layer, clay layer in some locations. That time over time, that snow above starts to sink down below, and as it starts to get deeper and deeper, we'll know soon in the springtime what kind of crop we'll have. The monsoon rains are very important too, because they come at a time when everything's starting to fill out. The corn cobs are starting to get full. The melons are starting to grow up. They need extra moisture to get a pretty good size. The bean pods are starting to fill out. So that extra boost of moisture during that time is very important. Now you can see all the ponding that occurs on that field. And we don't have eutrophication, where the oxygen gets sucked out of the water. It's because over time we haven't had any rain since March usually. So March all the way till the end of July we have no rain. But that's what deep planting and soil moisture allows us to do. With enough soil moisture, allows us the crop to continue to grow over time, so that when the monsoon rains come, we're able to take full advantage of that. So, fields are strategically placed. That's the other thing. If you look at the pictures in the middle there and the two ones on the side, you can see the big monsoon storm coming in there. It hits that mesa that's behind my field. It's called an alluvial floodplain. It channels its way down into my field, and I've put stones up there to move those channels into my field at times. And so then it ponds up like that. Like I said, it ponds up almost a foot deep in places. We often form a berm on one side of our field to catch that water that comes in. We plant north to south, and I was kind of intrigued by that, because we've always been told to plant north to south. And I didn't understand what that meant. But then, from the scientific standpoint of view, when I was down in Yuma, they said they plant north to south because that's the way the sun moves, and I'm like, wow, we've been doing that for 3,000 years. We just didn't know why we're doing it. We're just doing it. Right. And so it's kind of bringing back this knowledge that we have, and framing it in the scientific concepts that people could really understand. When I was at Cornell, I was always trying to prove myself. Well, how can you prove this? How can you do this? Where's the science behind this? You say that you hold all this soil moisture and things like this. Well, how do you prove that? And I always turn around and say, well, I have 3,000 years of replication, 3,000 years of our own scientific method, 3,000 years of doing things. To me, it makes a lot of sense. It's just a matter of convincing and getting the data in order to prove, yeah, this is what it's working and this is how it's working out. Okay. So, after that one practice, now this is one of the questions that I always get. Look at all those new soils just off of that one event. So that means I don't have to use herbicides. Not herbicides or pesticides. I'd use any mulch, any soil amenities whatsoever. No nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus that's integrated in our soils, especially in the Midwest. I don't have to use any of that, because of those new minerals that are being washed into my field year in and year out. I don't even have to rotate my crops. But you know what? It's taken 3,000 years of observation and trial and error to understand this system to where we can utilize it, and it's taken longer probably for those plants to adapt in that area too, but by God, it works. This place-based knowledge is also very important too. When I remember I was talking about, the different soil moisture capabilities. When we have a wet year, all of these plants that you're looking at, they have their own scientific name as well as their common name, but they all have different root systems. Some go down 6 inches, some go down a foot. And the ones that go down less, like the 6 inches, when we see a lot of those greening up in the springtime, we know we don't have to plant as deep. You always try to plant where the soil moisture is, and this tells you how deep you need to plant. It also tells you how far apart your plants need to be spaced. And I'll talk about the spacing here in 1 second. But, if you can see here, these plants are about 6 feet apart, most of them. The bean plants are about 3 feet apart, which is about one pace. Why is it done like that? Because it's designed to conserve soil moisture. You can see how we clump like that. So why is it done like that? Well, there's really several reasons why it's done like that. Now, here's the ingenuity. First of all, it allows those plants to shade each other, to cover each other, to protect each other from anything from the hot sun. It also has them to support each other when the monsoon rains come and they have these microbursts, they don't fall down. It also helps with predation because the crows that come in there, they're able to find the ears that are on the outside of this big cluster, but in the inside they cannot get to them because those things are tight. The other thing that does in the wintertime is when we knock those over. Now we only harvest the ear, we leave the whole rest of the plant on the ground, and that also adds organic material to the soil. But what makes that also important is that in the wintertime, when that snow comes flying across the field and starts blowing across the field, it clusters up on those remaining stalks. And what does that do? That puts more soil moisture into the ground. So what do we do the following year? We plant in between those clusters. The row goes down in between those two rows because that's where the most of the moisture will be at, because of just this one technique of clustering. This one technique in the arid semi-arid region we're from. That's the importance of living in a place for a long time. You get to understand what works and what does not. So, some of these are some of the place-based adaptive management techniques, and I'll just explain a few. Like I said, you'll have a cluster of corn plants. You'll have anywhere from 10 to 20 plants in there, and you thin them down to 6 to 7. You take those stalks and you pile around the plant to help conserve the soil moisture, lock the moisture in. And also if you look at the watermelon plant up there, if you look really close, you'll see little stakes that go like this around those vines, and that separates those vines because what happens with watermelon plants, the fruit is generated from the flowers. And when those plants get blown and they move around, they start intertwining and they knock those flowers get knocked off. And so in order to have optimal pollination, you always have to stake those apart. Now, what's also unique about this is something I learned when I was a kid too, because our fields aren't really that big. They're only about 1 to 2 acres usually. They're not your 4,000 acre field. You're able to manage these things by hand. And I'll talk about upscaling in a little bit. But down here, you'll see that little circle right there with those little bean things popping out. So what that's doing, what we do is we cover that up. That's a freshly uncovered bean little cluster right there. And we do that and we put a little piece of stick in there and we see a big storm coming in, because when the winds blow across the field, they always carry these sands and it'll just shatter the crap out of those leaves. But if we put sand on top and we put a stick to where it's at, then those leaves come up and they're just as good as when you put them in the ground. So the little shattering doesn't occur, and that gives that chance one more time to survive. And so that's important. So, we've also used this modified implements, because it's getting harder and harder now to find planting partners because there's getting fewer and fewer people that want to plant. But that's not the end of it, because I do see that all the time. And I'll talk about some of the programs I'm initiating to keep that going. But these modified planters, there's a simple, what I call straight blade hoe. That only scrapes off about 2 inches, 3 inches of the topsoil. So it's like a modern hoe. It just cuts the weeds. It doesn't disturb the moisture underneath. So it's very important. And in the back, we have a one-row modified planter that we came up with, which allows us to plant anywhere from 6 inches to 1.5 feet deep. And that's a long ways, but our plants have adapted from coming that depth. Not everything's planted that depth. Some of our beans, of course, and melon seeds, you can't plant them that depth, but there's other ways to get those to survive too, or to germinate, and that's to put water in the hole first. And so anyways, that's just using a little bit of modernity, as they call it, in order to adapt, in order to make sure that we're still continuing to do our system. So, what are the value of these place-based crops? These are just some of the seeds that I've planted, that I've collected, that I took photos of. But you can see that that's a corn plant that's grown in drought conditions, extreme drought conditions. But look at the health of that plant. That's off the charts right there. And all those seeds have that genetic trait in them. And I'll talk about that at the end of this and what I'm trying to do to help keep from that getting exploited. But it's just that type of thing. You know, things adapt over time. You know, I'm a big supporter of seed banks, but I don't like that things kept too long on the shelves because they tend to lose how the environment changes. We have like big seed banks that have 100-year-old seeds in there, I believe in Norway and places like that. But what happens when you take those seeds out and you plant them? Are they going to be just as viable? What happens if the locations are changed? You try to grow them out in a different environment. Will that environment allow them to even grow? You know, you have to ask these questions. It's important to understand this because I think as a society, as a kid, I was told that we need to try to raise things every single year. And if we don't raise things, that's okay, but we must try to continue so the adaptation occurs just like we do. So when I talk about this Western science and indigenous science, I kind of also like to bring recognition, but you can see now this is kind of a simple way of breaking down the scientific method. You'll see ask a question, do background research, communicate your results. That's all something we learn when in elementary school, at least here in the United States. You know, but then if you look at the Hopi method, you know, what is the scientific method in Hopi? You know, first it's observe environmental conditions. That's you asking the questions, you know. How do you do your back down research? Well, you communicate with your elders about farming. What did they learn? What have they done? You know, and then so how do you communicate your results? That's the kicker right there. Well, you share your harvest with your family or your community. You talk about it. You say, I did okay, I didn't do okay, you know, and then you eat your results if you can. See, that's what's different. You have a chance to eat your results, you know, and I think that's a lot better than me trying to quantify something, look at an Excel spreadsheet. I can't eat an Excel spreadsheet, but, you know, it's just kind of fun to think about. And so it's just kind of showing people in my mind that, yes, we're doing science too. We've been doing science. It's just framed differently. You know, it's just framed differently. You know, and so it's just people need to understand that because like I said, unless we understand each other, we tend to lose that communication. So lay the groundwork for the future. What is this? You know, this is something that came up when I was doing a mind map. It's something that I was said to do a mind map. And so at the center of my mind map is this revitalization of the American Indian food system. And around that comes all the funding entities. There's probably more, but these are the ones that I've been using. Around that is because I'm in natural resources, is what's make this revitalization is going to happen. What are the keys to make this revitalization happen? Any from land access to conservation to soil health to water, all integrated into that. And on the right-hand side are what I call my pillars of collaboration, my traditional agriculture and all the stuff under there, nutrition, all the stuff under there, law and policy, all the stuff under there, community engagement and all the stuff under there. Each one of those things could be funded if we're allowed to. But it's always this holistic approach. It's like that in regenerative agriculture. It's like that, especially in indigenous agriculture. It's about this holistic approach to trying to solve a problem that shouldn't be there, but because it's there, we have to find solutions so that we can have a healthier, more meaningful society, especially here in Indian country in the United States. So what am I doing right now? Right now, I'm doing these seed grow outs. I'm trying to find the best practices in order for my traditional varieties to grow out in dry years. And I'm not expecting every farmer at Hopi to adapt this, but I'm trying to find ways that I can scale out up there on a 5-acre field that we can use drip irrigation so that we can keep those seeds drought resilient, but by only using 2 years of drip irrigation, but able to create a seed pool so that we can give to the farmers, we can incentivize the farmers in order to keep planting. It's getting harder and harder to find seeds. Our ceremonies are continuing, but they require a tremendous amount of traditional crops. And so we need, in order to keep that going, we need to find solutions. We need to adapt in a way where we're not killing the drought vitality, but we're actually increasing things so that we have more farmers doing. The other thing that I would like to talk about, because I'm extension, is outreach. You know, we have the federally tribal recognized tribal extension program here, which is, in my mind, some of the best because they're in these communities. They're only in about 5 communities here in Arizona. We have 22 tribes, but their work is off the charts. They're very important, and I'm trying to find ways to keep that on a continuing basis, and I'll talk about how I'm planning to do that in a little bit here. But you can see the picture with all the people there. That was something that I formed out of one of my grants, what I call the All Pueblo Agricultural Alliance. There's 19 pueblos in New Mexico, 1 in Arizona, and 1 in Texas. we've been farming from the get-go. And so I want to continue on those traditions. When I go out to those pueblos out there, I can still see the young people out there planting, still raising chilies and things like that, things that they've been raising for the long, long time, like Hopi. And so I want to organize that. We've actually passed a resolution that the tribes can use to actually help them with their funding. We're also counting on, Governor Helen getting elected to New Mexico as the next governor, so that we're able to integrate some of these eyes and bring it up to a whole different level and things like that. So, this nutritional analysis that I'm also doing. Now, a lot of the stuff that I'm working on, looking at my own crops, my own family's crops, I've got enclosed databases. I'm a firm believer in data sovereignty. I'm a firm believer in keeping that in the public eye. But I also want to see what's in there so that I can find substitutes to put into our school systems if I can't have a traditional outcrop there in order so that our kids can become healthy. And I'll tell you why that's important. So a lot of my stuff was part of this experiment. I'm continuing on this into my next experiment is what makes these things so healthy for us? What is it that helps with our diabetes? There was a study that was done by Swensel, kind of an off the book study where she took 16 members of her own tribe up I forgot what Pueblo it was. She fed them that strict diet for 6 months. Nothing but traditional foods, and things like the onset of diabetes, some of the triglycerides, everything went backwards in a good way, just from 6 months. 6 months of eating traditional foods. That's what we're missing. We're also missing that taste, that beautiful taste of something that's rain-fed, something, we don't get from a bag of Doritos or potato chips or a big gulp. Why is that important? Why is this all important? Because we need it. Look at this statistic right here. Look at these statistics. Diseases of the heart, cancer, accidents, diabetes. Recently in my trip to Salt River, I wanted to know if it was true that I was hearing that there's some cancer clusters up there on Salt River. Why is that? Why isn't it being reported? I was told because they're really looking at their cases of diabetes right now, but cancer shouldn't be up there. And so part of my work, that's why it's very important to look at our soils. There's been no monitoring up there. I confirmed that yesterday. They know it's being applied, but nobody's doing the monitoring. We need to look at soil health. We need to look at that. That's part of what I do. That's part of what IRES does. That's our team, trying to look at after our community. That's very, very important. So, what is it all about? It's education for the next generation. I kind of talked about FERTEP there. Dominic's over there leading it right now. Really, my hat's off to him. Their grant runs out in about a year. Then what are we going to do? And so I'll talk about that. And I think you guys should be aware of this. I'm aware of this. Arizona, for the first time, Arizona Extension is doing a study. What are they doing a study on? They're doing a study on what is the economic impact of agriculture on Indian lands in Arizona. That's going to be important. Why is that? Well, let me give you some facts on that. First of all, 50% of the producers, over 50% of the agricultural producers in Arizona are American Indians. Out of the 12 million acres that's actually farmed in Arizona or under cattle production, 80% of that is under American Indian jurisdiction. And so that economic figure that I'm talking about will give me the leeway and the leverage to see if Arizona will create a line item specifically for FERTEP agents, get them off the grant. We have an obligation as a land grant institution to serve our community, and that's all the communities. And so that's important to me, and I'll go on record as saying that. So then I just talked about the Arizona Tribal Agricultural Facts. I think that's very important. This happened to be at my site, this picture. I want to talk about that just for a second, but on my Grow Out site, I was able to bring in tribal youth from different high schools out from this OLE program. I believe it's the Our Land, Our Health, Our Environment. And so they're able to bring the students there. We were able to both combining what were they learn? What did they learn? They learned a little bit about traditional science. They learned a little bit about Western science. So it was a good thing. And we're going to do that every year at that particular site because it's important that the young people know that what's out here, what's out here. So, this is an article. I want to share this because I always talk about seeds, but this is an article that me and Professor Sosi put together for benefit sharing. We looked at the WIPO Treaty, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization Treaty. And in there now it says that, in order to get a global patent, you need to say where the source was from. It was from a indigenous community. You may be upfront with that. Otherwise, you can't get a global patent. It's something that the United States has not signed on to, but if they want to move their agricultural products out there, they're going to have to do that, and hopefully they'll have to do that. And also, this will be the first time, if I can do this, now this is a long shot, trying to get these seeds brought under cultural patrimony under NAGPRA. Cultural patrimony is things like like funerary objects, ceremony objects that are given back to the tribe, but it also comes with a whole lot of intellectual property rights that we don't have in our seed system here in the United States. And it has teeth in it. A lot of federal Indian policy, as you know, doesn't have teeth in it. An example of no teeth would be the American Indian National Freedom of Religion Act. That has no teeth in it. It gets to the court all the time and it gets knocked down. But this one does. This one does, and it's very important. So I wanted to draft a paper. We wanted to draft a paper to set the beginnings of that process, to let people know what's going on. And it's a beautiful paper. You can find that online. It's very readily available in open access from the UCLA Law Journal at UCLA Law Review. Also just genetic sequencing. So what are we going to do when we do this? This is something that I'm working on. This is something that I also announced. I want to take these hybrids that were what I call hybridization up here, not hybrids, but these folklore heritage varieties. And I want to do genetic sequencing on this, but I will not do that without the permission of the tribes where they came from. I just won't do that. I won't sacrifice my integrity. I won't do that. But what I hope to do is to get approval to do that, because then I have a genetic fingerprint. Then I can go up to places like Monsanto and Bayer and say, I understand you have a drought-tolerant short corn variety. Where did you get this genetic material from? Right? I have a fingerprint right here that says this allele is the same one that you're saying that you created. What can we do to help benefit share? I do not want to stop the research. Let's get that clear. I do not want to stop the research. I just want to have benefit sharing for those communities who took over 10,000 years to develop these beautiful varieties that enabled us to survive. So I want to make that clear that I'm not trying to stop the research, but I want to create benefit sharing so that we can make sure that these native-led food organizations have an adequate source of funding so they can continue to serve their communities. Now, how valuable are they? They're real valuable. IRS supports some of them. During COVID, I got to see some of the ones at Hopi get out there and unload all those food trucks. There wasn't any government officials over there. It was all these grassroots organizations. And I really appreciated that. This vision for the future. Now, here's something that I worked on in NAF. I'll talk about it real quick. It's a $3 billion Indian agricultural plan. It has things like process centers, everything on Indian land, but it also enables those communities off Indian land to benefit from it. It creates the value addedness of agriculture, which is important. For example, down in Yuma, you cannot take 1,000 acres out of production of lettuce because there's no money to make up for it, right? So why not value add the product someplace, so that the farmer, the people who produce it, can pull that 1,000 acres out of production for 1 year to give his land a rest, but it's all about that collaboration, working with each other. So, getting towards the end, what is my future goals looking forward? What do I frame myself for, Ron? Some of these I talked about. The first one would be to create an endowed chair at the U of A to create funds for the longevity and future programming here in these project areas. Not so that I could increase my salary or the next person behind me increase their salary, but to have a source of program funding year in and year out that would allow us to continue. And I'm working on that. Establish a fund for genetic sequencing. I have people that are willing to do that. Expand this tribal network so more tribes in the Southwest through policy analysis and briefs and look at these natural resources. And I'm working on that. And also establish collaborations between Indian and non-Indian producers to raise stuff. And if the Indian tribes won't do it themselves, have the non-Indians do it on Indian land to get good quality food into those schools, good nutrition food into those schools. Establish indigenous seed protection. I'm working on that. And advocate for tribally based agricultural codes. That's one of the important things, because if you have a code, you're able to stand up in court and say, yes, I have a code. Shouldn't people who aren't from here be honoring that? So it's my way of self-determination and sovereignty. With that, for me, it's really about this regeneration, giving to the next. Because I was here. I was fortunate to be here. And that's kind of a long story, but I'm lucky I'm here. I'm very lucky I'm here, and I'm lucky that, that I have people out here who come to these things to actually learn something too, and I hope you learn something. So I really appreciate that. And, that's pretty much it for my presentation. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to learn.
That was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for sharing with us. Your presentation was wonderful. I'm hoping that we can transition smoothly into some questions for Dr. Johnson. In the chat, or if you want to jump on screen, you're welcome to as well. Sharon Megdal.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. I'm not sure I'm going to quickly turn off my background screen, but I do have this corn here, Michael. It's in my
Yes,
office.
I know.
If you need the blue corn, if it's of use to you, let me know. But it's been in my office ever since we first met, which was, I think, when you first came to campus.
Yep,
You
long
probably
time ago.
know-
Yep.
You know better what year than I.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for a very far-ranging presentation. I have a question related to one of the items on your last slide or near last slide about communication between tribal and non-tribal farming. And from my vantage point, I'm not a farmer, so I'm not in these same discussions. But I don't necessarily, I get the feeling there's not that much communication and interaction. And so my question twofold is my impression correct? And what could be done, what do you see that could be done to increase that? Because I see multiple benefits coming out of that, including the point you raised in your slide. So
Well, I think, Sharon, it really starts with this soil analysis. I know that Joey and is also involved in this too. He's here today. It's just looking at what those conditions of those soils are, and then and also bringing out the fact that you have a cancer cluster here on the reservation and talking to these tribes to incentivize them to pull on them and say, look, we need to look at these things. We need to look at these things, and we need to look at how we negotiate our leases so that we're able to work on things. And I'm looking at Crit, for example. They were talking about the Colorado River Indian tribes. They used to have like a small processing center there. Why can't we open that back up a little bit to and have so the people don't have to carry their cattle all the way to California to get processed. We all want to become healthy. We all want to have access to resources. We all want to benefit from these resources, and we need to do it together. So that's kind of my short answer to your question, Sharon. If that's plausible.
Thank you. And next we have a question from Dr. Blankenship.
Hey, Michael. As always, yeah, enjoy. I always learn so much from you. Great talk. Your passion is infectious in the best way possible, not in a bad way there. And you're such a great ambassador for, as you know, I think a lot about soil health as well. My question is, I know a substantial portion of tribal lands, of ag lands, are leased to non-Indigenous farmers. And what do you think, I mean, in terms of food sovereignty, or, I'm just interested in your perspective on, do you see that changing in the future? What would it take to sort of shift, allow the Indigenous farmers to grow more food, and as you mentioned, and that would improve the health and so forth?
Well, I think it's going to, Joey, I think it's going to take cooperation, like I said, between the non-Indians and Indians. And I think, with the leverage that the tribes would have, I think that they would be. I honestly don't feel, in 20 years from now, there'll be much non-Indian agriculture on Indian land. I mean, away from Indian lands, and more people want to be farming Indian lands. Only because the way the water is being used, we're taking a lot of our, agricultural land, at least on the non-Indian part of it, and selling it to development. And I know there's some people that still want to remain in there. So why not have the young people come to Indian lands where it's not so much to rent land, but do it in the right way, do it in a regenerative rate, and have the tribe rule out, put out codes like you see, like the agriculture codes that Arkansas came out with to dictate some of this policy. It's their land. They should be able to do what they want to. They should be able to tell what they want the farmers to do, how they want it to be farmed. They should do that. And if people don't want to do that, then what are they there for? But we need to look at soil health first, because we need to show the negative impact of what's happening, especially around these cancer clusters. I mean, I mean, here in Yaqui, for example, whether it's our agriculture related or not, and it's probably not, it's probably just the food, but they're diagnosing 4-year-old kids with type 2 diabetes right now. So the incentive is there. It's a matter of getting the opportunities to go to the tribal leaders and say, this is what's happening. Let us try to help you correct it if you would like to. And I think that's why these studies are important. I'm not by means a professional person like you are, as far as looking at all going down to the nano stuff of soils, but I know that something's causing stuff, and we need to get this going. And I know for a fact that whatever your soils are, it goes right into your body because it's uptaken by the plant. And so that's basic, but we need people with the real data, persons like yourselves, to do the really hard work and get this moving. And so, but yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we have Nico, and then we'll get into a question from Dr. Chief.
Hey, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I really appreciated, especially the slide with the young kids on it. When I was an undergrad here, I did the school and community garden workshop, and then when I taught at Tucson High, I helped run the farm club. And so my question kind of like aligns with that. Of like, what are the kind of strategies that you use to kind of increase engagement from like the next generation to kind of to pick up these skills, to listen to these stories, and kind of like transfer on this knowledge?
For us, it's really about getting it more into the schools. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with reservation-based schools as far as what they're offering. At Hopi, for example, we don't even have an agricultural program up there. So it's really upon the grandfathers and the uncles traditionally to go out there and teach those kids how to farm. But it doesn't mean that we can't create opportunities otherwise. I've got an organization, and there's a couple up there that we're actually teaching youth how to do this. We're actually sending some of the youth out to help some of the elderly people with their farms. And so it's just that engagement. In the cities, it's a little different. I mean, you're only there for a little bit. I have an initiative that I'm trying to get going. It's called One Seed, One Child, where I give every first or second grader a cup of soil and some water and have them plant it on their first day. And my thing is not about transplanting that or anything like that, but just the act of planting alone, getting their seeds, their little hands into that little soil and popping something in there, and then maybe watching it come up. And smiling. That's what it is. Taking it home and saying, look what I did today, I'd rather have a kid take home a plant than a big lollipop,
Oh, totally. Yeah, the one thing that
it's kind of like that, Nico. And so, yeah, so that's how I would look at it. It's just constantly finding these little tiny what I would call inexpensive ways to get people to do things, because agriculture shouldn't be expensive. You should be able to get seeds and soil and just plant them up, and that's it. Shouldn't be expensive at all, and just try to keep the politics out of it. I just, one of the main things that kills everything that we do is just politics. And we need to look at our kids as not political pawns, and just have them smile. That's all we need to see happen to is smile. That's it, man.
Yeah. My favorite thing though was all the kids wanted to plant chilies and tomatoes.
Oh, that's cool too. Hey, at least they're planting something though, Nico. At least they're planting something, at least they can say, I went home. This is where tomatoes come from. It doesn't come from Safeway.
We're just like, well, the thing is though, you got to come back during the summer, because those chilies and those tomatoes ain't going to be ready before we get out of school.
Yeah, I know.
And then they all did, like they were like, oh, I'm going to stick around and then come back. So anyways, thank you so much.
I appreciate that, Nico.
Thank you. And so we'll have our final question here before we jump into the student session. And so it says here, I attended an international water conference at the University of Oklahoma, and one of the keynote speakers said that university extension is just an arm for big ag, which is not sustainable, and very few faculty teaching on sustainable agriculture or organic farming. What are your thoughts on this, and how can we teach sustainable ag in university extension nationwide?
Well, it really has to start off with our mission. I mean, I could understand that. There's places like Nebraska. If you look at the extension model that's typically out there, it is designed for that. It's designed to create profit. It's designed to help that stakeholder increase his profit or her profit. And it's about that. And in order to increase your profit, you need to be efficient. You need to have a lot of quantity. And so those two things don't work well with the environment. And so we need more, what I would call, more support in these school programs to kind of get that idea out of there and move away from that, and try to find an alternative. But it's very hard because, we're so indoctrinated into that. and we find something that might be working and something else comes to counteract that, and so I just feel as a land grant institution, our mission is to serve everybody, and that includes even the small person, the small farm holder. We need to focus more on nutrition more than we need to do with quantity and efficiency. And I understand that we're trying to, as a university, we're trying to make money and things like that, but we need to make people too. And I think that's where it's at. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for today. I think everybody can see how infectious your passion is for your working community, and really appreciate you sharing your insights. And also that I think it was an amazing way to end the conclusion in terms of your vision for food sovereignty and some of your work. So really just want to take that time to thank you on behalf of our team. It's truly appreciated. And yeah, again, we just appreciate your time and the knowledge you've shared. We also want to thank everyone who joined us and our co-sponsors at the Indigenous Resilience Center, the UA Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, and the Office of Societal Impact for making this seminar possible. We also invite you to join us for the next talk in our fall 2025 Native Voices in STEM seminar series, which is on October 8th and features Dr. Joseph Hoover. Aside from that, would also love to have you join us this Friday at 5 p.m. for the IRES 4th anniversary community gathering. Really looking forward to that this week. And so before we officially close, we encourage students who would like to stay online for a more informal Q&A session to do so. So this is really just a great opportunity to ask additional questions, seek mentorship, and really just engage in discussion with Dr. Johnson in a smaller student-focused setting. And again, thank you all, and we do look forward to seeing you next time.